dive into the more controversial and fun topic because it keeps things interesting. So the term subverted city seems to be the academic term for it, but I figured a lot of people wouldn't know what we're talking about, so I put in the Irredeemable city. It's known as the Ir Hanidachat, and it's one of the most difficult aspects and laws of the Torah to understand. And one of the questions that comes to mind for me is, did this ever happen? That's true for some of the other more difficult things as well, when it comes to the wayward son, when it comes to, in general, the death penalty, as well as a leprous house. I found as well that there's an opinion in the Talmud that it never actually happened. And so I put a search in Google, and I found a really interesting article in my favorite Torah website, the Torah.com or whatever it is, something like that. And so I kind of based this off of that, and I also included the link. And basically, he argues that even though there isn't an exact replica story of this happening, there is a story that's similar enough to assume that they were thinking of this law. And that's the destruction of Geba and the Benjaminite tribe. So before we get into that story, which is fascinating in itself, I tried to cut it down a bit, but it's really good drama and narrative, so I'll try to get the whole thing in there. But before we get to it, I just wanted to go into a little bit of what we're dealing with here, right? So our parsha starts off, Re'ei Anochi, see this day I set before you blessing and curse. Blessing if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you this day, and curse if you do not obey. Right? And it's a very stark contrast. Sephorno makes it even more clear. Pay good attention so that you will not be like the nations of the world who relate to everything half-heartedly. It's a pretty big generalization right there. Always trying to find middle ground. Remember that I presented you this day with the choice of two extremes, opposites. The bracha, the blessing, is an extreme in that it provides you with more than you need, whereas the klala, the curse, is another extreme, making sure that you have less than your basic needs. You have the choice of both before you. All you have to do is make a choice. Okay. So my thoughts are, when it comes to Torah laws that challenge us, this is arguably the most challenging to our modern morality. We are not just talking about collective punishment here, which is an issue. Well, this should have been a little further down. So basically, as you'll see in a moment, the laws of the subverted city is that you need to kill everybody, destroy everything, and never rebuild it again. It doesn't get more dramatic than that. So we're not just talking about collective punishment here, which is an issue in itself, but of a genocide of an entire city, basically. It certainly seems inconsistent with the following verse from Proverbs. Deracheha, Darche Noam, we sing this, Deracheha, Darche Noam, right? Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths peaceful. Killing an entire city is anything but peaceful. The stark contrast in Sforno's explanation place morality on a simple binary choice. While I'm a firm believer in right and wrong, I'm also a believer in moderation. Extremism can often be counterproductive and lead to unintended consequences. The troubling story of the Levite's concubine, which I'll get to later, and I don't know if you're able to link from your computers or your phones, but this is just a link to the Wikipedia page about this story. And that's the way it's known, as the Levite's concubine. Akiva is a good demonstration of the downfalls of extremism. Before getting into the story, we'll first discuss the particular law from our parsha, Irredeemable, that according to Professor Aaron Dembski in the article, Was There Ever an Irredeemable? Was the theological motivation behind it. Right? Professor Dembski believes that he doesn't use these words, but that's my interpretation, that basically they were operating on the principles of Irredeemable. So what is an Irredeemable? Oops, sorry about that. Okay. So this is from our parsha this week. If you hear it said of one of the towns that the Lord your God is giving you to dwell in, that some scoundrels from among you have gone and subverted the inhabitants of their town, saying, "Come, let us worship other gods whom you have not experienced," you shall investigate and inquire and interrogate thoroughly. If it is true, the fact is established that abhorrent thing was perpetrated in your midst. Put the inhabitants of that town to the sword, and put its cattle to the sword. Doom it, and all that is in it to destruction. Gather its spoil into the open square, and burn the town and all its spoil as a holocaust, which is a pretty hard word to hear, to the Lord your God, and it shall remain an everlasting ruin, never to be rebuilt. But nothing that has been doomed stick to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his blazing anger and show you compassion. And in his compassion increase you. Yes.
Can I just interrupt for a minute?
Sorry?
The word Holocaust, what is it in the Hebrew here? It is Shoah? Okay.
No. Hold on, let me find it.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. So this is 17. There's Kol Shalala and all the Lut, Tikvat, rather Tochava, Vesarafta, Ve'esh, Shburnis Ve'ir, Ves Kol Shalala, Khalil Adonai Lahecha, V'haisa Tel, Olam. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which word he's translating as Holocaust here, but it's definitely not Shoah.
Oh, okay. I'm just curious when that came into being. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. But just ending this text, and it ends off, and in his compassion increase you, as he promised your fathers on oath, right? And so on the one hand, we're being told to do this gruesome, horrible thing, and it's like, oh, and that's going to be, and that'll bring compassion. And it's just, how do you have those two at the same time? And I'll touch a little bit on some of the explanations that are given, but for the most part, this is really about getting to the story Akiva, and seeing how this law influenced them. Although the main text does not give a name for this law, the rabbis called it an ir hanidachat. The word nidacha is used as a verb in the Hebrew. They may have also gotten it from the term from the following text in Jeremiah. The verse, right, Jeremiah, we were just talking about, he was around during the destruction of the first temple, so he's talking about Jerusalem. He says, Kiale arufalach mimakosayach arpaf noam Adonai ki nidacha, right, so ir hanidacha. But I will bring healing to you and cure you of your wounds, declares the Lord. Though they called you outcast as Zion, whom no one seeks out. Of course, thinking of that story and how Jerusalem was basically an Ir Hanidacha at the time for the Babylonians should make us be a little bit more compassionate. But, here we have this law. All right. So Mishnah and Sanhedrin. A city may be designated as an idolatrous city, right? So the only, at least in the Torah, the only sin that would call for something like this is idolatry. A city whose residents all practice idolatry, although the all part is not agreed upon, because there's discussion about there being a majority of the people and what number of people. So the all is not exactly the right right here, which is interesting because I'm pretty sure this is from Rabbi Steinsaltz, and I'm reluctant to criticize Ezra Chain since he just passed away a few days ago. Anyway, and therefore, according to Torah law, all the residents must be killed and the city must be destroyed, only in accordance with the rulings of a court of 71 judges. All right, so this is basically, it needs to be a Supreme Court decision. It can't be, a Pinchas, somebody just deciding, let's go. It needs to be deliberated. Additionally, the court may not designate a city as an idolatrous city if it is on the frontier, close to the border of Eretz Yisrael, and 3 adjoining cities may not be designated as idolatrous cities, but the court may designate 1 city or 2 adjoining cities as idolatrous cities. The rules about not designating cities that are sensitive because of national security, right? So the last part there is understood to mean that they can't do that to a city on the border because of safety. So it reminds me of the discussion we had, I think it was last week, where it says you're not going to be able to conquer the land really quickly, because if you do, you run the risk of being attacked by wild animals, since you're not, the general understanding is because you're not going to be enough people and they're going to just hang out there. So here as well, it's saying there are certain limitations. This is the Talmud. The Torah doesn't tell us, the written Torah doesn't give us any limitations on it. All right. In the following Tosefta, the Tosefta is a body of work that supplements the Mishnah. Right, so the Talmud is kind of takes the Mishnah and expands it. The Tosefta was supposed to be a supplement, although at times it expands it. There's also debate about when it was actually completed. That word always slips my mind. Redacted. Redacted is the word. And some say it was redacted around the same time as the Mishnah. Others say it was later. In the following Tosefta, it is stated unequivocally that this law is theoretical, as it also states about the wayward son and the leprous house. And there may be other cases, but those are the ones that I'm aware of. It never actually happened. However, as can be seen from the Talmud text that follows this Tosefta, Rabbi Yochanan dissents and claims that I saw and I sat on its ruins. So essentially he's saying, did it happen? I was literally there. But he doesn't say where it was, or you'd think if he's going to challenge everybody, it would be nice if he gave a little more detail. All right, so here's the Tosefta. It's a long one, so we'll see how far we get with it. A beguiled city, another term for it, has never existed and never will. Rather, it is written about in order to say, quote, examine and take reward. Right? This is an incredibly bold assertion to make. The Torah explicitly gives a law, and the Tosefta, and we see this as well in the Talmud, says basically this law was never meant to be done. It's simply there for study. It's a fascinating argument. Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi Eliezer says, we don't make 3 beguiling cities in the land of Israel, but we do make 1 or 2. Rabbi Shimon says we don't even make 2, rather only 1 in Judea and 1 in the Galilee. Here in the book, we don't even make 1 in order that Gentiles won't disperse and destroy the land of Israel. The city is permitted if they spend 30 days in the swords and basins. All right, we're just going to skip all of that. So notice that in addition, so this is going to be the next test. Notice that in addition to Rabbi Yonatan stating that he was at an Ir Hanidachat, the Talmud at the beginning brings another argument for why it is impossible for the destruction of a Jewish city to be destroyed. All right, so here goes. So this is from Sanhedrin. Most of the discussion is in Sanhedrin, and Sanhedrin is the name of basically the close equivalent. Obviously, it's not quite the same of the Supreme Court. Unlike in U.S. law, and we talked about this recently as well, the Supreme Court is kind of the appeals. A lower court judges. And if you don't like the answer, you keep pushing it up. The Supreme Court, but that's secondary to why I was bringing the source. The main one is Rabbi Yonatan says, this is not so, as I once saw an idolatrous city that was condemned to destruction, and I even sat on its ruins. And basically, like the Wayward Son and like some other things, the rabbis put so many restrictions in place that it became impossible. But what the original intention is for the day. The parallel to the story of, so this is this. Now we're going to get into the actual story. The parallels of this story to the story of Sodom are pretty strong. It also calls to mind the seemingly irredeemable city of Nineveh in the story of Jonah and the whale that we read on Yom Kippur. So I am going to ask for readers just to break it up a little. But first I'm going to get past the Hebrew. Who would like to start?
I'll start if it's okay. Okay.
Sure.
Hi, Robert.
Hi. Hi, Sandy. In those days when there was no king in Israel, a Levite residing at the other end of the hill country of Ephraim took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Once his concubine deserted him, leaving him for her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, and she stayed there a full 4 months. Then her husband set out with an attendant and a pair of donkeys, and went after her to woo her and to win her back. She admitted him into her father's house, and when the girl's father saw him, he received him warmly. Go on. Then
right,
the man...
So just hold on. Okay. Hold on for a second. Robert, 1 second.
Yeah.
So does everybody know what a concubine is? No, because not everybody agrees on what a concubine is.
We thought we did.
In halacha, yeah, exactly. Nothing is simple. So in halacha, there's different discussions about what that actually means. Are we just talking about a mistress? Are we talking about polygamy? So there's an opinion that says that they're basically a wife, except that they don't get a ketubah, meaning they don't have rights of the wife. And there's also, their limitations on their children and inheritance and all kinds of tricky things like that. Anyway, what we know is that this was, and we'll see this from later in the text, that this was really early on when they came into Israel, before there were even the kings. All right, you continue.
Then the man, his concubine, and his attendant started to leave. His father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Look, the day is waning toward evening. Do stop for the night. See, the day is declining. Spend the night here."
So, Robert, just hold on for one more second. So I skipped this narrative schleps out. So I skipped about 5 or 6 verses before that. So we're continuing from there. But it is back and forth. Stay a little longer. No, I'm leaving. Okay, fine. I'll stay a little longer. Stay a little longer. You got the drill. All right, go on.
See, the day is declining. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. You can start early tomorrow on your journey and head for home. But the man refused to stay for the night. He set out and traveled as far as the vicinity of Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a pair of laden donkeys, and his concubine was with him. Since they were close to Jebus, and the day was very far spent, the attendant said to his master, "Let us turn aside to this town of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside." Let's see, where am I? "We will not turn aside to a town of aliens who are not of Israel, but will continue to Gibeah. Come," he said to his attendant. "Let us."
So hold on. Yeah. Hold on one second. So why is Jerusalem not part of Israel? Because they hadn't conquered it yet. That's my understanding of it. Right? King David conquers it about 1000 BC. So this is before that. So the people that were present there were the Yevushis, the Jebusites. So at the time, he didn't want to stay there because it was enemy territory. And so they went to Gibeah. All right, continuing at 13.
"Come," he said to his attendant, "let us approach one of those places and spend the night either in Gibeah or in Ramah." So they traveled on, and the sun set when they were near Gibeah of Benjamin. They turned off there and went in to spend the night in Gibeah. He went and sat down in the town square, but nobody took them indoors to spend the night. In the evening, an old man came along from his property outside the town. This man hailed from the hill country of Ephraim and resided at Gibeah, where the townspeople were Benjaminites. He happened to see the wayfarer in the town square. "Where," the old man inquired, "are you going to, and where do you come from?" He replied, "We are traveling from Bethlehem in Judah to the other end of the hill country of Ephraim. That is where I live. I made a journey to Bethlehem of Judah, and now I am on my way to the house of the Lord, and nobody has taken me indoors. We have both bruised straw and feed for our donkeys, and bread and wine for me and your handmaid, and for the attendant with your servants. We lack nothing." "Rest easy," said the old man. "Let me take care." Where am I?
20.
"Let me take care of all your needs. Do not on any account spend the night in the square." And he took him into his house. He mixed fodder for the donkeys. Then they bathed their feet and ate and drank. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the town, a depraved lot, had gathered about the house and were pounding on the door. They called to the aged owner of the house, "Bring out the man who has come into your house so that we can be intimate with him." The owner of the house went out and said to them, "Please, my friends, do not commit such a wrong. Since this man has entered my house, do not perpetrate this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out to you. Have your pleasure with them. Do what you like with them, but don't do that outrageous thing to this man." But the men
All right,
would
so
not listen to him.
hold on one second, Robert. So does everybody see the parallels here with the Sodom story?
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredibly similar.
Mhm.
All right, continuing 25.
But the men would not listen to him, so the man seized his concubine and pushed her out to them. They raped her and abused her all night long until morning, and they let her go when dawn broke. Toward morning, the woman came back, and as it was growing light, she collapsed at the entrance of the man's house where her husband was. When her husband arose, When her husband arose in the
27.
morning, he opened the doors of the house and went out to continue his journey. And there was the woman, his concubine, lying at the entrance of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "let us go." But there was no reply. So the man placed her on the donkey and set out for home. When he came home, he picked up a knife and took hold of his concubine and cut her up limb by limb into 12 parts. He sent them throughout the territory of Israel, and everyone who saw it cried out, "Never has such a thing happened or been seen from the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt to this day. Put your mind to this, take counsel and decide."
All right. Well, let's give somebody else a chance.
Okay,
So this is the next chapter. Thank you, Robert.
thank you.
Does anybody want a chance? That's the other.
I'll read it, Ruth, even though I'm not
Okay.
happy with the story.
Yeah, there's not a lot to be happy about.
Thereupon all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead marched forth, and the community assembled to a man before the Lord at Mizpah. All the leaders of the people and all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 fighting men on foot. The Benjaminites heard that the Israelites had come up to Mizpah. The Israelites said, "Tell us, how did this evil thing happen?" And the
Right.
Levites,
So just a reminder that Geba or Gibeah was a Benjaminite town. That's why it's referring to the Benjamites.
yeah. The Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, replied, "My concubine and I came to Gibeah of Benjamin to spend the night. The citizens of Gibeah set out to harm me. They gathered against me around the house in the night. They meant to kill me, and they ravished my concubine until she died. So I took hold of my... Where's my soul?
6.
I took hold of my concubine, and I cut her in pieces and sent them through every part of Israel's territory. For an outrageous act of depravity had been committed in Israel. Now you are all Israelites. Produce a plan of action here and now." Then all the people rose as one man and declared, "We will not go back to our homes. We will not enter our houses. But this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will wage war against it according to Lot. We will take from all the tribes of Israel 10 men to the 100, 100 to the 1,000, and 1,000 to the 10,000. Remember that. To supply provisions for the troops, to prepare for their going to Geba and Benjamin, for all the outrage it has committed in Israel." Excuse me. So all the men, 1,000 men,
11.
all the men of Israel united as one man, massed against the town. And the tribes of Israel sent men through the whole tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What is this evil thing that has happened among you?" Sorry. "Come hand over those scoundrels in Gibeah, so that we may put them to death and stamp out the evil from Israel." But the Benjaminites would not yield to the demand of their fellow Israelites. So yes, could you continue? I'm having a problem.
So the Benjaminites gathered from their towns with Gibeah in order to take the field against the Israelites. On that day, the Benjaminite mustered from the town 26,000 fighting men, mustered apart from the inhabitants of Gibeah. 700 picked men of all this force. 700 picked men were left-handed, every one of them Could you let me just raise this up.
All right, I'll bring it up a bit.
Okay, right. Every one of them could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. The men of Israel, other than Benjamin, mustered 400,000 fighting men, warriors to a man. They proceeded to Bethel and inquired of God. The Israelites asked, "Who of us shall advance first to fight the Benjaminites?" And the Lord replied, "Judah first." So the Israelites arose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. The men of Israel took the field against the Benjaminites. The men of Israel drew up in battle order against them at Gibeah. But the Benjaminites issued from Gibeah, and that day they struck down 22,000 men of Israel. Now the army, the men of Israel, rallied and again drew up in battle order at the same place as they had on the first day. For the Israelites had gone up, let me see.
Hold on, here we are.
Let's find where the Israelites had gone up and wept before the Lord until evening. They had inquired of the Lord, "Shall we again join battle with our kinsmen, the Benjaminites?" And the Lord had replied, "March against them." The Israelites advanced against the Benjaminites on the second day, but the Benjaminites came out from Gibeah against them on the second day and struck down 18,000 more of the Israelites, all of them fighting men. Then all the Israelites, all the army went up and came to Bethel, and there they sat down, weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and presented burnt offerings and offerings of well-being to the Lord. The Israelites inquired of the Lord, for the ark of God's covenant was there. We may have to raise this up.
Yeah, coming up.
Right. In those days, and Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, ministered before him in those days. Shall we again take the field against our kinsmen, the Benjaminites, or shall we not? The Lord answered, "Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hands." Israel put men in ambush against Gibeah on all sides. And on the third day the Israelites went up against the Benjaminites as before, and engaged them in battle at Gibeah. The Benjaminites dashed out to meet the army, and were drawn away from the town onto the roads, of which one runs to Bethel, and the other to Gibeah. As before, they started out by striking some of the men dead in the open field, about 30 men of Israel. The Benjaminites thought, they are being...
Hold on.
They are being routed before as previously, but the Israelites had planned, "We will take the flight and draw them away from the town to the roads." And while the main body of the Israelites had moved away from their positions and had drawn up in battle order at Baal Tamar, the Israelite ambush was rushing out from its position at Marach Gibeah. Thus 10,000 picked men of all Israel came to a point south of Gibeah, and the battle was furious. Before they realized that disaster was approaching, the Lord routed the Benjaminites before Israel. That day the Israelites slew 21,100 men of Benjamin. Let's see where we are. All of them fighting.
Where the arrow is.
Then the Benjaminites, we have to move it slightly, it's blocking.
Real.
Yeah, right there, it's blocking the words.
There's a.
Oh, sorry.
Still
something blocking?
I'm sorry? Shall I
Still something blocking?
No.
All right, now it's okay.
All right.
That day the Israelites slew 21,100 men of Benjamin, all of them fighting men. Then the Benjaminites realized that they were routed. Now the Israelites had yielded ground to the Benjaminites, for they relied on the ambush which they had laid against Gibeah. One ambush quickly deployed against Gibeah, and the other ambush advanced and put the whole town to the sword. The time had been agreed upon by the Israelite men with those in ambush. When a huge column of smoke was sent up from the town, the Israelite men were to turn about in battle. Benjamin had begun by striking dead about 30 Israelite men, and they thought, they are being routed before us in the previous fighting. But when the column, the pillar of smoke, began to rise from the city, the Benjaminites looked down then, and there was the whole town going up in smoke to the sky. We have to raise this up a little.
Um, 41.
Yes. And now the Israelites turned about, and the men of Benjamin were thrown into panic, for they realized that disaster had overtaken them. They retreated before the men of Israel along the road to the wilderness, where the fighting caught up with them. Meanwhile, those in the town were massacring down in it. They encircled the Benjaminites, pursued them, and trod them down. From Menuhat to a point opposite Gilbay on the east. That day, 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them brave men. They turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. But the Israelites picked off another 5,000 on the road, and continuing in hot pursuit of them up to Gidom. They slew 2,000 more. Thus the total number of Benjamin who fell that day came to 25,000 fighting men, all of them brave. But 600 men turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. They remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. The men of Israel, meanwhile, turned back to the rest of the Benjaminites and put them to the sword. Towns, people, cattle, everything that remained. Finally, they set fire to all the towns that were left.
All right,
Now,
let's give somebody else.
yes.
Does anybody else want to read?
I can read if nobody else wants to.
Go for it.
Now the men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah. None of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjaminite. The people came to Bethel and sat there before God until evening. They wailed and wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel that one tribe must now be missing from Israel? I was wondering the same thing. Early the next day, the people built an altar there, and they brought burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. The Israelites asked, is there anyone from all the tribes of Israel, who failed to come up to the assembly before the Lord? For a solemn oath has been taken concerning anyone who did not go up to the Lord at Mizpah. He shall be put to death.
So basically now they're starting to backtrack. They're starting to say, hold on a second, what did we do here?
Right,
they're trying to rectify. Yeah.
The Israelites now relented towards their kinsmen, the Benjaminites, and they said, this day one tribe has been cut off from Israel. What can we do to provide wives for those who are left, seeing that we have sworn by the Lord not to give any of our daughters to them in marriage? They inquired, is there anyone from the tribes of Israel who did not go up to the Lord at Mizpah? Now no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp, to the assembly. For when the roll of the troops was taken, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was present. So the assemblage dispatched 12,000 of the warriors, instructing them as follows. Go and put the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead to the sword, women and children included. This is what you are to do. Prescribe every man and every woman who has known a man carnally. They found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 maidens who had not known a man carnally, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole community sent word to the Benjaminites who were at the rock of Rimmon and offered them terms of peace. Thereupon the
Anyway, well, I think we can cut off here. You get the gist. This is a horrible incident. And right,
Horrible.
it get much worse than this. And then to try to make up for it, let's kill some more people so we can give those guys wives. It's just and so, you know, it puts us in this position of trying to understand these laws. And, you know, the best explanation that I, you know, that makes sense to me is that laws like this were given for a lawless time, right? And we'll just jump till the end. The last verse, it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. It was very tribal. And so they needed laws that matched that reality. How that translates to modern times is more tricky. Anybody want to say or ask anything or express their horror? If anybody's talking, I don't hear you.
It doesn't even make sense, though. Although a lot of violence doesn't make sense. That nobody stopped and said, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What are we doing to ourselves? It also...
Right, and it makes you wonder... Go ahead.
No, you go. Well, I was going to say it also makes me wonder, where was the role of God in this? It almost sounded like it did. He allowed that to go on. And then, in fact,
right,
he encouraged...
And it makes you wonder... Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's certainly, historically, whether this story ever happened or whether it's rhetorical, there's no archaeological evidence for it. There is a site in Israel that archaeologists found kind of a layer of destruction, and the archaeologists that found it said this is Gibeah, but there's only one problem. You know, there could have been a lot of other times that towns or cities were destroyed. So just because you found destruction around that time doesn't mean that it's this story. There's also 2 other towns that are mentioned with the same name in different parts of the Torah. So I would like to believe that it never happened. I would feel a lot better about that. And this doesn't officially mention anywhere the subverted city Irredeemable, but it certainly seems to have the hallmarks of it, you know, burning everything and all of that. Go ahead, Iz.
Go ahead, Iz, he said.
I'm sorry?
He said, go ahead.
Rabbi, it is. I have a question.
Hey.
When you think that Moses went up to the mount and came down with the 10 commandments, and the commandments stress peace and love and honor thy neighbor, etc., etc. And then you read this, and not only here, but God says, if you don't follow me, I will take away the rain from your land, there'll be no crops, etc. Something just doesn't mesh. Either there is a benevolent God who stresses to us the benevolence of dealing with other people, or what you read this morning is maybe just some kind of a story.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's very hard to reconcile, and you know, it's kind of nice that the Talmud says that it never happened. It doesn't say this story never happened, but it says this law never happened. And the idea of a benevolent God versus a wrathful God is something that theologians have struggled with from earliest time. How to reconcile that. The term theodicy is the struggle, essentially, of trying to understand divine justice in a terrible world. So I don't have a good, simple answer. I wish I did. The one that makes sense to me is that at that time it was lawless, and the only way to keep cohesion and peace and a good society was to take extreme measures. It's still not a great answer, but it's the best one. It's the one that works best for me.
It seems to be the answer that's happening today in our country. Take extreme measures.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's interesting.
Well, in some ways there's extreme measures, in other ways there's not.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that even within the context of the story, you can see the hierarchy of values. I mean, it was a patriarchal society, but it was okay to put out a young girl who was a virgin, but not okay to put out a man. I mean, implicitly, that's there. And the whole issue of a concept of homosexuality, how abhorrent that was to, the writers of the Torah, and the same thing, in the biblical story, where they said they're not putting out the men, but you can have the women, his daughters, and then they were struck blind. So on a hierarchy of horrible things, abhorrent things, clearly the homosexuality seems to be among the top, implicitly or explicitly.
Yeah, and the tribalism, right? So the extreme that happened was not so much because of the rape and the murder. It was because they wouldn't give up their tribesmen, right? Because initially the Israelites said, we give us these people so we can bring them to justice.
Right.
So initially it seemed like, okay, that's reasonable. But they got mad when the Benjaminites putting tribalism above justice, or at least that's how they saw it. And they said, you know what, if you're going to act that way, then you're all going to face it.
Yeah.
Still a lot of tribalism in the middle.
So the rabbis, we have tribalism today in many ways, and in some ways it's a good thing. It's good to take care of your own, or your charity begins at home, or however you want to put it. But the downsides of it are pretty obvious too.
And who gets punished in the case of adultery in some of these, I'll call them backward communities, because that's what it seems to me. It's the women, not the man who perpetrated the crime.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's some of these things.
The honor killings and.
Yeah.
Well, the men do get punished in this story.
So rabbinic Judaism. Yeah, well, and then the question, so there's debate in terms of, okay, so in the law of the subverted city, what about the women? What about the children? And all along, there's all kinds of problems. For example, the assumption here is that the women are, wouldn't go and worship idols. It was only the men who worshipped idols. why is that, why is that automatic? Women have a mind of their own. They can just as easily go and, worship another. And then the children one is, of course, the hardest one. And there's debate about, do they fall into it? But the text seems pretty unambiguous. But the rabbis did everything they can to extrapolate from every word, every letter, anything, as many limitations as absolutely possible to make sure that this never happened. And I brought, I'll post this online, but I brought from the Mishnah, you can see here the following text from the Mishnah has many more restrictions on destroying a city. I also brought, unfortunately, it wasn't translated, from the Ramban, the discussion about children. But yeah, there isn't a lot of comfort in this, but I think that it's important to discuss, because when we gloss over these uncomfortable texts, then there's a part of our mind that's still like, hey, but what about that? So that's my thinking on it. All right. I will see you all on Monday. Felix, I'm sorry that we can't hear you, but I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you soon.
And is Dan still on?
All right, guys, take care.
You too. Dan?
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, Dan is on.
Oh, okay. Can you stay on for a few minutes? I wanted to go over the survey because I'm looking at seating possibilities. All right.